Welcome, friends. Really happy to have session 2 on Anti-Dühring with Landon Frim. So, folks already know what sort of. Hopefully, if you've tuned in last time, or if you haven't, you can check out the video from the first session on the YouTube page. Today, we're talking about section 2, political economy. And with that said, Professor Frim, floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. Let me just pull up the chat right here so I can send everyone out a link. Well, okay. Thanks, Daniel, for having me back. So I'm not going to do a big sort of opening statement like I did last time, because this is part 2 of 3 parts. Big picture in terms of the topography. Classically, for Anti-Dühring, Engels' Anti-Dühring, part 1 deals with his method and his epistemology, his theory of knowledge. How do we approach any of the sciences? Part 2, as you say, deals specifically with political economy, critique of political economy, and specifically the idea of how capitalism works, especially where it comes from, why it tends towards crises, and therefore where it's going. And then the third part, of course, deals expressly with the future, with socialism, as well as socialist strategy and tactics. But so it's not just that, right? So part 2 actually has a lot in it. It deals with political economy, specifically the political economy of capitalism. But I've been able to break it down into 7 principal themes. And so what I did last time, although I promise I'm not going to read at you anymore, because I think that's bad for this sort of medium. But what I have done is, to make it digestible, broken it down into these 7 themes, and I've called, I think, what are the most important excerpts on those 7 themes, and I have a link to it right now in the chat. If you want to look at that, if you want to follow along, again, except for one thing which is particularly beautifully written, I'm really not going to read at you today, but I will sort of riff off of these excerpts, and I did post them up there on my website again, so that if people want to follow along, or preferably if people would like to challenge me on any of the exegetics or the substantive content, I really, really, really enjoy that. So please do so, and that's why I'm giving you the ammunition to volley back at me. Okay, so what are these 7 themes? So if you scroll down to part 2, I think they are these. A, the interplay of morality and political economy. B, Engels' claim that in order to do political economy, we have to talk about production preceding exchange, not only chronologically, but logically. C, we have a resurgence that we saw in part 1 of his basic historicism. So this denial that we can simply, in the manner of, let's say, 18th century French materialists, just make grand universal categorical pronouncements about the nature of reality or human nature or the economy. D, the idea, and this is related to part B, that economics comes before force, right? So the material conditions is something which in some logical sense precedes repressive apparatuses that keep people in line. E, some things that Engels says about distribution, class, and superstructure. F, why capitalism is bound up with this idea of not only surplus labor, but specifically surplus value or surplus exchange value. And G, Engels' sort of cursory but important findings about the ruling class and his theory of the state, specifically, what it is, where it came from, and where it's going. That all being said, I've allotted myself about, 6 minutes and 27 seconds to sort of just say some things about each of these topics, because I'd like to reserve for each of those sections some time for some open-ended questions. Now, I thought last time went okay, but what I'd like to do is have a little bit more sort of robust back and forth, if possible. So what I'd like to do, if possible, is make use of the reactions function. So if everyone can look at the bottom and see the reaction, if you hover your mouse right below, if you're in gallery view, the reactions. Okay, let's see. If you can, give me a thumbs up. Let's see who can do that. All right, some of you. Good, more than half of you. All right, so we'll try and, if possible, use this as a way for sort of like gauging. How do I get rid of this damn thumb now? Um, how do you get rid of this?
It goes away. It goes away after a minute or so.
Oh, there's no way just to kill it off on its own?
No, you can press lower hand. You press raise
really?
and then lower. Raise, lower.
Good. Let's do that. We'll do raise and lower hand since you can control it more specifically. Fine. And then we can have some sort of maybe more robust interplay. In any case. Okay. So without further ado, let's get on with it. So we remember last time from part one, one of the main critiques that Friedrich Engels has against Eugen Dühring is this idea that all of politics is subsumed within economics, and all of politics is subsumed within morality, and all of economics is subsumed within politics. And so, by the transitive property, everything just becomes sort of a value judgment. His critique about this is that since value judgments are these, universal proclamations which are not necessarily based on any kind of commonly observable, empirically observable material situation, then what you're simply going to have is sort of like, one self-proclaimed genius making some universal claim as against some other self-proclaimed genius, and there's no way to choose between them. So I teach undergraduates, right, in a philosophy program, and this is the common critique that they have as well, which is that, philosophy doesn't make any progress, okay? Because everyone thinks that they're right, that they're absolutely right, and that everyone who comes before them is absolutely wrong. I think Bertrand Russell said a half clever thing to that effect as well. The prerequisite of being a philosopher is believing that everyone that came before you is not correct. Well, so that bleeds into part two when he's talking about political economy. So here I'm on slide A, if you want to follow along from that link that I sent you. And where Friedrich Engels starts in his critique of Eugen Dühring is by saying that, he has this very antiquated 17th, 18th century style of doing political economy that is really based in social contract theory. So instead of dealing with classes, instead of dealing with entire populations or something more naturalistic like geographies, instead of giving a materialist economic critique, we start off with this idea of two wills, okay? And from this idea of two wills, Eugen Dühring himself says, society starts off with two wills, equal in every respect, neither of which can demand anything of the other. And in part one, Engels makes fun of this. It's like, where are these two wills, shorn of all particular, racial, gender, economic, and trappings. Anyway, he says there are these two wills. Part of the way that Engels makes fun of this is by saying that this is like a Robinsonade. It's something like it's something like taking the idea of Robinson Crusoe, right, and trying to derive modern political economy and modern economic exploitation from that story of two individuals. In this case, Robinson Crusoe, and infamously his man Friday, right, the person who, at one point in the story, begs to be his servant or begs to be his slave. Well, according to Eugen Dühring, and this seems to be exegetically accurate on Engels' part, Dühring's claim is that all rather indirect forms of exploitation today, so for example, the idea that free wage laborers are exploited, okay, is simply a sort of historical echo of the original political sin of force that was slavery. And so it can be adequately explained by this idea of two wills, right? A master illegally, immorally, right, as a matter of original sin, exploiting a slave. Again, based on this idea of sort of social contract theory, right? Two individual wills having everything in common and total equality, but one does something wrong. Okay. Moving along to slide 3, right? Engels says that it may very well be the case. It may very well be the case that economic exploitation today is brutal. It might be the case that it is in fact immoral, but his claim is that this is in fact not an argument, but only a symptom. And so the immortality, the brutality of economic exploitation today is actually just a symptom of an original sort of material condition which gives rise to that brutality. He says in slide 4 then, the excerpt there, that the moral critique that many of us spontaneously feel emboldened to give today to capitalism, right, is therefore merely a reflection of material realities, right? So it is, in other words, we have the normative, right? What's right or what's wrong. We have the descriptive, right? How things actually operate and whether they're operating well, whether, you know, a certain mode of production is on the ascendancy, it's forming itself, or if it's at its zenith, or if it's at its point of crisis and decay, right? And he says like that, right? In fact, the descriptive comes before the normative, right? The reason why many more people are emboldened to critique capitalism today is because, in fact, it's in a stage of crisis and decay. In fact, it is beginning to break down, okay? Which is quite different, and this is slide 5, okay, before I sort of lead up to the question, which is quite different from Dühring's position, which is that it is entirely timeless, right? It's based on this social contract idea of two pristine wills, one of which does something bad and enslaving the other, okay? And therefore, Dühring's position is not that capitalism appears to be brutal, appears to be malfunctional because it has reached certain descriptive crises. Instead, Dühring's position is the position of Proudhon, that property is as such theft. Property is and always has been theft because the only way that one can accumulate property is in fact illicitly, is as a matter of force and a matter of injustice, right? That one only acquires property, builds it up by illegally, brutally, immorally stealing what is not yours, that is to say, the labor of someone else. Engels, because I think he's really a very good writer, says, well, very well then, the domination of men over men is evil. I might in fact agree, but what Eugen Dühring fails to do is to explain how the domination of men over men comes about through the domination of men over things, right? So unless you can explain how our ability to produce things, ability to use our labor power to produce a surplus of things, unless you can explain in the material realm how our productive abilities allow us to produce more than what is necessary to live and reproduce ourselves, and that's it, you cannot explain the systematic, centuries-old practice of people dominating other people. All right, we'll go more into this today, but I wanted to focus by way of the sort of first question I want to ask on slide 3. So I'm going to share the screen right now. And I won't read the whole thing, but there's an important section here that is a bit of a continuation of the discussion we had last time. So let me read it. A couple sentences in, he says, Engels says, the task of economic science is rather to show that the social abuses which have recently been developing are necessary consequences of the existing mode of production. At the same time, also indications of its approaching dissolution, and to reveal with the already dissolving economic form of motion the elements of the future new organization of production and exchange, which will put an end to those abuses. In other words, right, the moral critique is coming about because capitalism is in crisis. These crises point the way towards the new thing, socialism. All right, here's the kicker, and the thing that I bring up to my students. Engels says, the wrath which creates the poet is absolutely in place in describing these abuses of workers under capitalism, and also in attacking those apostles of harmony in the service of the ruling class who either deny or palliate them. In other words, capitalist bourgeois economists who say that capital and labor are sort of in it together, apostles of harmony. But how little it proves in any particular case is evident from the fact that in every epoch of past history. There's been no lack of material for such wrath. All right, I'm ending the screen here. Engels is tipping his hand here a little bit. He's tipping his hand in a very interesting way, given everything that we discussed and at points criticized in part one. He says that, yes, the moral critique doesn't explain why capitalism is in crisis now. The moral critique doesn't explain why the critique of capitalist relations is at its fever pitch now as opposed to 100 years earlier. But he admits that the wrath which creates the poet is absolutely in place. In other words, he seems to admit that exploitation of workers is in fact immoral. My question to my class and my question to you is, why? Why does he say this? Why is he able to say that the wrath of capitalist exploitation of workers under capitalism, why is it in place? Why is it legitimate, valid, justified? I'm not necessarily taking issue with it, but what is his reason for saying it? And you know, at the beginning of this, Daniel and I were talking about, you know, Marxists having to deal perennially in every generation, right? You said with Nietzsche, and especially for undergrads I've seen, this tempting idea of getting beyond good and evil, right? You had like a bad time in Ethics 101 as an undergrad, and you had a bad time in parochial school, and the nuns telling you all those thou shalt and thou shalt nots, and you just want to, God damn it, get beyond it, right? It's tempting, especially for like a 19-year-old, right? And especially for a 19-year-old that has perhaps self-described as sort of radical frame of mind. But that doesn't seem to be Engels' position. Engels seems to think exploitation is wrong, it's morally wrong. All right, so here's my first question, and if you'd be so good as to participate by raising your hand. Would you be willing to agree to the statement that exploitation of workers under capitalism is morally wrong? Not just that it's inconvenient, not just that it's unsustainable. Would you be willing to say that it's morally wrong? All right, if you think so, all right, raise your hand. Like your digital hand. If you can. If not, it's fine. All right. All right. Okay, lower up. So 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, and then Daniel has like an actual like flesh hand. Good. 8. Good. Very good. Anyone willing to say, all right, so lower him. Anyone willing to say, no, I'm not gonna like judge you, I'm not gonna like put you on a blacklist, right? I'm just curious. Anyone willing to say no? Like I just don't think that it's appropriate to say that exploitation of workers under capitalism is immoral. You might oppose it, you might be fully revolutionary, you might have all sorts of ideas, right, in line with all sorts of varieties of Marxism, but immoral just strikes you the wrong way. Anyone willing to say, I won't go there, I won't say the I word, I won't say immoral? Okay, go ahead and raise your hand. Cowards. Well, that's statistically unlikely, but fine, good. Then, all right. Next question. Oh,
I'm willing to play your game.
Did the person next to Daniel? Did you raise your hand?
No, I'm willing to entertain this debate.
Fantastic. All right, good.
My position, Landon, is that the entire category of morality needs to be abolished.
Good.
Precisely because there's no coherence in it.
Yes.
And for me, if I want to talk about the suffering of the working class or the degradation, the humiliation, the domination, etc., 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 I don't give a about using morality to make my case. God damn it! So because morality is only the expression of a class position, of the bourgeois position at the end of the day. So therefore, I reject it, and I think all Marxists should reject it as such. If you want to be true to kind of proletarian I don't know, the proletarian position, let's say.
Can I ask you a question?
How's that? Yes, you can.
That's amazing. This is amazing. This is exactly what I want. Can I ask you a question? Can I ask you a
Sure.
question?
Sure.
You don't have to answer.
Okay.
But is this, are you being Glaucon here? Are you playing devil's advocate, or is this something you like really believe?
No. I'm setting up a straw man for you. I'm trying to. I'm playing at that guy argument. I'm inventing that guy. You know.
I appreciate it.
It's not really real. It's something kind of fictional. But
That's
let's entertain it. Let's entertain it.
All right. So that all right, good. So there's a lot there. So morality is the expression of a particular class position. The morality that we're used to now is bourgeois morality. That position would therefore mean that there's no such thing as proletarian morality, which Engels says that there is, but who cares? Exegetics doesn't rule the world. It doesn't matter. He might be wrong. Fine. Good. And that there's no answer that anyone's ever come up with when it comes to morality, which Engels does say. And therefore, if you want to really help the working class, what the hell are you going to, ethics 101 for? Just go out on the picket line or, dig a trench, right?
Or capital could be construed actually as a form of impersonal domination, which alienates us far more ubiquitously, we could say. So yeah, the person at Walmart may be dealing with exploitation more than my professional job from home, but that doesn't matter. We're still both alienated because there's this impersonal system of domination that's kind of going on, and what we need to do is just help people get a minimal grasp on that fact, and we can all unite and overthrow capitalism.
So we can get so if but only we understand that we're exploited and alienated, there will be a sort of automatic. Is it automatic?
I don't know.
So I went to school. I won't name any names, but Harrison knows who I'm talking about. I went to school with someone, and we got into a debate. A debate's like a polite word for it. We got into an argument after 3 Heinekens about Marx and species being, and whether exploitation and alienation are things which are sort of universally descriptive of class societies, and whether people sort of naturally will want to like move beyond them. And this person, being a sort of unreconstructed cultural relativist of sorts, basically said, well, look, if what you want to do is pick up trash all day and starve to death, well, maybe that's what you want to do. So, like, if you're willing to say that, right? And I'm not saying I am willing to say that, but if you're willing to say that, if you're willing to say that there is simply sort of an infinite plasticity of ways that you can be human, then it would follow that simply realizing that you're being exploited under capitalism won't necessarily mean you'll do anything, because it might just be a lifestyle choice, right? So, and I promised I wouldn't, like last time, I wouldn't like name drop proper names in philosophy, but okay, I lied. So, like, as a Spinozist, I kind of agree with that kind of sort of descriptive naturalistic morality, which is like, people are a certain way, people want to thrive, people want to not be exploited. So if but only you explain to them their objective circumstances, eventually they won't put up with it anymore. And that way you can sort of do ethics without the ethics being spooky, ethereal, hovering above nature, right? I still call it ethics. Other people won't, but okay, semantics. But if you're not willing to have a sort of idea of universal human nature, then that's not going to work, right? Who is, I forgot your name, I apologize. Who raised their hand and you're in the box that says Daniel? Did you, would you care to stand up against morality today on Sunday, March 13th?
It's a bit early for me. It's actually Monday, 7:30 a.m. here.
Oh my God, where are you?
We're in Sydney, Australia.
Oh my gosh. All right, I have relatives over there. Okay. Thanks for coming.
But I guess the reason I raised my hand was also a little bit to be controversial.
Yeah, great.
I mean, of course, we can say capitalism is bad and make that moral claim, but I think what Engels is saying and what Marx is saying, and actually reading this book just affirms the fact that Engels did understand political economy, and he, people talk about value from theory, for instance. I know I don't want to be doing the thing where you drop.
No, please. Yes.
For instance, like Michael Heinrich, who's a German value. I'm not sure if he identifies as such as a value from theorist, but in that sort of school of value from theory, as Daniel mentioned, there's that term impersonal domination, where you're not dominated as a serf and lord. There's some sort of personal domination of one directly dominating the other, but rather there is a whole structural system behind the domination of peoples and the working class.
Yeah.
And so it's not a moral claim to say that capitalism is bad, that capitalists exploiting the worker is bad, but rather it's capitalists have to exploit the worker. And so we have to understand why it's necessary for capital to exploit workers. And so it's the necessity of the action under a specific mode of production that is necessary to understand in order to make some sort of claim about why capitalism is bad. Because if you keep saying capitalism is bad, it doesn't necessarily mean that you understand why it's bad or why it needs to be abolished. And that's been my experience, for instance, in political organizing at universities. People get into Marx, people get into capital, but they never actually read it. They never really understand the critique of political economy. And then, 5 years later, they just become right-wing or conservatives.
Sure, because things aren't beautiful yet, so you may as well sort of retreat into the spiritual, something like that, right? As a moral philosopher, reading Anti-Duhring by myself, I keep hitting my head against the wall, thinking well, okay, but you're never getting to the normative, you're never getting to the value, right, claim, and therefore you're never getting to sort of the motivation for doing the work. But you're absolutely right. When I talk to people who simply do activism and no theory, then I want to hit them over the head with Anti-Duhring, right? Because it's you don't understand any of the sort of structure of what you think that you're fighting against, right? So granted, I think you're right. And I apologize, is it Ksenia or? Okay, great. I think you're absolutely right that, sorry?
Sorry, it takes me a while to unmute. Ksenia, you pronounced it well.
I apologize. I think you're absolutely right that simply having a moralistic critique of capitalism doesn't explain why it's wrong or how to sort of get rid of it or what it might turn into. My question is, I agree with you. My question then is the inverse, which is having a sufficient descriptive analysis of capitalism enough to make us oppose it? Is knowing all of the facts about capitalism enough to have us oppose capitalism? Or could one know all the facts, be like the Laplace's demon of capitalism, just know every single atom of what makes capitalism, and still be good? Yeah, fine, let's keep on with this for as long as possible. This is the position of certain neocons. This is the Leo Strauss position, which is indeed the historicist, Marxist might be right. Eventually, there might be sufficient crises to overturn the system, but I don't care. Let's drag our feet. So that's the sort of question. I saw a hand from Doug, and I saw a hand from Jim.
I'd say you could accept the Marxist position and just fight against it. There have been Marxists who've actually said this is a value-free science. Yeah, and I won't do the proper name drop thing, but just having a moral critique. There are plenty of people who have moral critiques of aspects of capitalism. They can be very left-wing, they could be very right-wing. Just listen to Christian fundamentalists talk about like moral decay and whatnot. And I don't think they're actually anti-capitalist. They want something really horrendous. But I think but this moral critique is not enough, because it's it's bad, it's exploited. But I think this whole section is political economy. This is about the material world. This is about, to quote Madonna, if I can quote a proper name, is
Yes.
it's about the actual mechanisms, the inner laws of motion of capitalism. It's what leads the system to have those kind of landmines in it that cause it to blow up,
Yeah.
that make it break down in crisis. You're saying, or what I think Marxists are saying is the system is prone to crisis, prone to breakdown, and we want to get rid of it so we can have a society where we can realize our true human nature, our true human flourishing, because this system denies that, and it ultimately is leading you down to barbarism and ruin. And therefore, if you accept the Marxist critique of capital, that the system has these unresolvable contradictions, then to fight against it, to fight for proletarian revolution, is to fight for a society of human flourishing, is to fight on the side of history, and it's to ultimately, you could call that proletarian morality or humanism if you want.
Yeah.
But essentially, I think the proletarian morality is tied to a theory of humanism. It's tied to actually understanding the inner laws of motion of capitalism. We can, it's good if people recognize that capitalism is morally wrong, but you want to ground that in something real. So it's not just something ethereal in the air.
Yeah.
And therefore, you can say this isn't just some pie in the sky thing. We can actually make this happen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm just to be clear, 100% sold that we need the sort of descriptive structural analysis of capitalism and its crises to do any of this meaningfully. But again, and I think you answered it well. My question is like the inverse though, like, is that not only necessary but sufficient, right, to motivate people? And I think, if I don't want to put words in your mouth, Doug, but and tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you said something like, well, it's necessary and it's sufficient, but just in case you also have a theory of human nature and human flourishing is good.
I mean, I don't think it's actually sufficient. You need organization, leadership. You need what I call, if I can quote myself as a master thinker, proletarian Jacobinism.
Say again?
Proletarian Jacobinism, organization. Okay. Basically, I'm just saying you need a Leninist party.
Right.
I'm just being fancy about it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. We have a lot of people wanting to say things. I think next up was Jim.
To drop a name, Schumpeter accepted much of the Marxist analysis of capitalism, but he was not a socialist. He was very much opposed to socialism, even though he thought that some form of socialism would inevitably arise, but it was not something he looked forward to. It was something he was opposed to.
Yeah. No, so my Spinozist grand narrative metaphysical dream, and I think what sort of the cutting edge of Marxist philosophy is, and feel free to disagree, but I think the sort of cutting Spinoza's edge of Marxist philosophy would be, can we develop a sort of more basic universal vocabulary which explains both the sort of structural story of how capitalism comes to be hegemonic, and then through crises becomes something else, becomes socialism, and also at the same time something about human nature and human flourishing, which is inherently normative as well as descriptive, right? So I think that, and I think a lot of us are saying something similar, I think that merely the sort of description of what capitalism isn't sufficiently motivating, though it's absolutely necessary, as against the sort of pure moralists. But we also don't want to be dualists about it, right? We don't want to get stuck into a situation where, on the one hand, we have a descriptive story of what is, and on the other hand, we have a normative story about what should be, but these are just sort of their own worlds, right? Wouldn't it be good? Wouldn't it be more powerful if these things could be both sort of originating from some kind of common source, some sort of basic story about how things work? Which, by the way, really militates against what Engels is doing in part one of this, right? Because he's working in the 19th century, he's really resistant to that sort of grand narrative, as much as he claims to like people like Spinoza and at times Hegel. I think, I don't know if Johannes or Matthew was next. Daniel, do you know?
I think Matthew.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. I just wanted to chime in a little bit, mostly to kind of review where we've been, but
Please.
the as far as I can read it so far, the focus of most of Marx's analysis is to describe the system and to give the reader a sense that not only this way of doing things in this mode of production, but the ones before, and probably the ones after, will all have these landmines that Doug talked about. And I resist the term landmine because it almost makes it sound like it was a mistake, like something that wasn't meant to be there. But the fact is, if one follows the dialectical reasoning, the idea of being created, growing, stabilizing, and then going down, like an airplane, is implied in every single one of those things. And so I think it's right to say that the descriptive is not enough, because if you're made to understand that these are the natural, again, bad word, but naturally occurring way that things are going to develop, as time goes on, then one could say, okay, well, I mean, this is how it was supposed to be. I mean, what do you want?
Right.
But the focus, I think, for motivating the change and getting rid of those landmines, getting rid of the crises, getting rid of the features of this current system that cause the exploitation, that cause the harm, that cause the feeling bad and going on to something good, there very much has to be motivation for that. And usually people find it in their everyday lives, but is it systematized? Probably, and
yeah,
very messily, I'm sure, compared to what Marx did with the descriptive end. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
No, thanks. That's good. And a sort of epiphenomenal question to that is, for people who are, at least for my students, people who are new to reading Marx and Engels, there's something very convenient and very suspicious about a book which says, I don't really care about the normativity. I don't care about the ethics of it so much. I care about the description and the structuralism, but also it really gets better and better. And the last thing that I'll talk about, socialism, right, is the best of all of them. A lot of them get very sort of suspicious about sort of this, and I'm not saying there's not a good way to explain this, but many of my students get suspicious of saying, well, see, he doesn't want to do ethics, but he wants to say that descriptively it simply works out for the best, given a long enough time scale, right? I think that's something we need to deal with as well. Johannes, I apologize for making you wait so long.
Well, I was going to, on your comment, the difference between analyzing something and being morally engaged in the world. Which one can better support to mobilize people to act? And
yes.
You were before referring to Nietzsche's book, Beyond Good and Evil. On that book, Nietzsche says that he said, knowledge kills action. Action always needs a veil of illusion. So analysis, like constant analyzing of something, usually hinders action. Action is kind of a way of relating the world, where you conceptualize your movement and so on through the process of making itself and so on. So a passive analyzing somehow can hinder action from unfolding.
So this is interesting, and it's precisely why I think it's so imperative to see whether you can have a vocabulary which includes both the descriptive and the normative at the same time. If you don't, Nietzsche may well be right. I think you can have such a vocabulary, but if you don't, Nietzsche may very well be right that you have these two domains, that of action and politics and motivation and morality, and that of sort of passive analysis and description. And if never the two meet, that's it. You're left with sort of a choice between them. Interestingly, and this doesn't necessarily make it right, but interestingly, Engels takes exactly the opposite position, right? In part one of the last things we discussed was his notion of freedom, and basically cribbing from Hegel, Engels says that freedom is simply the insight into necessity. Right? The more that we understand intellectually what the object is, the more that we're able to choose how to manipulate it, use it to our benefit, right? Whereas if we don't have an insight into necessity, into how the world is put together, what Spinoza would call the order and connections of things, then we become passive, right? That the object becomes a sort of mysterium, something outside of us that we can't control, but rather controls us. Whereas Nietzsche takes a completely opposite point of view epistemologically, which is why philosophy is so important, I think. But thank you for bringing that up. I think I want to move on because I'm just on A, only A of A through G, but this is great. Connor. Where's
Yeah,
Connor?
sure.
There you are. Yeah.
How's everybody doing? Just really quickly, like, I think Marx and Engels' big beef against capital fundamentally, like in terms of like a moral question, is that the worker has no sense of agency, right? They are compelled to do things. And yeah, I think this is part of what Engels was getting at in his, like in the quote you gave us. I think he used the word harmony, and like the capitalists will tell us that these are free decisions that both we as capitalists and the workers are making together. But being a worker, you know, having no control over my life, I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, it makes questions of morality more ambiguous because like, I think for any action to be questioned on like moral grounds, it is assumed that we could choose to do this or that, right? And under the conditions of capitalism, that's not true. So yeah, just some like basic fundamental stuff, right?
And I'm gonna be a terrible person and plug something I wrote. Just give me 1 second. Here it is. Okay. I'm gonna put this in the chat right now. In case anyone wants to yell at me later. So good. So what you're bringing up, Connor, and please correct me if I'm misrepresenting at all, is that like the problem with morality talk is that it involves like this idea of sort of like a free choice, right? Classically, and this is certainly the way that Kant talks about it. In fact, Kant will say, at least partly, that like the reason why we know we have a free will is because we have this moral faculty, and you need to have a sort of nearly voluntaristically free will in order to meaningfully do ethics, right? So, but the question is like, is that the way you need to do ethics? That's the thing that I sent, the article that I wrote, Impartiality or Oikeiosis. Classically, yes, the classic morality 101 class you get is that, you know, ethics is about making choices, good choice, bad choice, and you're culpable for your choices because you're free to make those choices one way or the other. But might it be possible to have a sort of descriptive ethics, which is to say that insofar as we are rational, we will necessarily choose the best. Something that wouldn't be alien to Plato, who denied the idea of the weak will, denied the idea of akrasia, wouldn't be alien to Spinoza, who Engels himself celebrates, right? From that rationalist perspective, there's no sense of speaking truth to power in this sort of voluntary free way. Instead, we necessarily do what we perceive to be best, or we are caused, in other words, from the outside through illusion or simple ignorance or modifications of the body or whatever. We are caused to do what is not the best, what is not optimal, right? We could do that kind of ethics, right? And as one way, at least, of bridging the gap between the descriptive and the normative, couldn't we? What I'd like to do is skip over, because it's 4:47. I would like to skip over B, slides B, because they are boring, and look at C, at least one thing from C, which is this. That, you know, in trying to argue against the sort of all too quick universalism of Eugen Dühring, Engels lumps him in with certain 18th century economists, Adam Smith, also the physiocrats, because all of them try to deduce universal laws based on what they consider to be universal reason. But he makes fun of them by saying that, at least with these 18th century economists, that the universal man possessing universal reason turns out to be just a very thinly disguised merchant, city dweller, a burgher, a sort of proto-bourgeois figure. And if you want to look at C, so this is presentation C, slide 3, he doubles down on this historicism point by saying that the economic laws which govern production and exchange in, let's say, modern industrial era England are entirely different from those which operate in, let's say, Tierra del Fuego, which Tierra del Fuego in Anti-Duhring is like his placeholder for a not industrialized society, okay? Then he says an interesting thing. He says, but at the same time, it goes without saying that the laws which are valid for definite modes of production and forms of exchange hold good for all historical periods in which these modes of production and forms of exchange prevail. In other words, wide use of metallic money is wide use of metallic money anywhere that occurs, right? The rules which operate and govern the use of metallic money in exchange are the rules wherever, whether you're in South Asia or the North Pole, okay? And by extension, the claim would be that, you know, industrial capitalism is industrial capitalism. Feudalism, more or less, is simply feudalism wherever one might find it geographically or whatever year it might be. And I was curious about the position of the group as to whether this is true. Because it grates against the sort of more culturally relativist tendencies that we encounter today, right? Certain more culturally relativist tendencies, whether they like that name or not, would say that no, one can have a specifically, let's say, Andean form of socialism, as opposed to a Eurocentric Western socialism. Whereas other people might say, no, actually capitalism is capitalism, it has certain laws, feudalism is feudalism, socialism is socialism, and you're engaging in a sort of semantic deceit. All right, here's my next question with, did Daniel say I opened a Pandora's box? Yes, that's accurate. So here's my next question. Okay, is Engels right about that? So yeah, there's historicism, but actually the rules which govern a certain mode of production, whether it be capitalism, feudalism, socialism, what have you, those are the rules, regardless of geography, regardless of culture. Okay, let's see if this works. If you think that that's a true statement, at least in broad strokes, why don't raise your hands. All right, cool. All right, lower them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Who says BS? That's not true. Raise your hands. Interesting. All right. Well, then we'll move on. Fine. Okay. I would just say this. It is interesting that he says this because it fleshes out some of the suspicions that we had when we were talking about part 1, right? So in part 1, if remember, when he was talking about like epistemology and a philosophy of nature, and really, although he'll never use the word metaphysics, right? There is all of this talk about you can't understand or know that anything exists except through empirical investigation. His phrase is a long and wearisome investigation, right? But then he goes on and says all sorts of categorical universal things, like matter and motion are intrinsically tied to one another, matter and motion are infinite and eternal, and there was no beginning to the universe. How in the world could you know that simply empirically? And here again, in part 2, when we're talking about political economy, right, we have this sort of what appears to be something more than a mere empirical statement, something rather more universal, that there is an essence to what capitalism is, there's an essence to what feudalism is, and whenever these relations of production and exchange exist, they exist according to those rules, at least in broad form. Okay, fine, interesting. Let me show you something more upsetting. So if you skip down to slides 6 and 7, we'll start with 6. So this is C. I'm going to read this so that I don't accidentally get accused of saying something horrifying, which in fact is a quotation from a text. So if you go to slide 6, I apologize, presentation 6, slide C, slide 6, presentation C. Let me share that right now. Share screen. Share. So moving on to the notion of historicism, and directly related to his critique of a pure sort of moralism, Engels says this of prisoners of war. He says that up to the time, one had not known what to do with prisoners of war and had therefore simply killed them. At an even earlier period, eaten them. So what is that up to that one time that he is talking about? Engels here is talking about the time at which the level of productive technology reached a sufficient state at which point the average worker could do more than simply produce and reproduce their own existence. In other words, that technology had reached a level which allowed for there to be meaningful, sustained surplus labor, okay? And therefore that labor started to itself, or labor power, I should say, started itself to have value. It says, up to that time, one had not known what to do with prisoners of war and had therefore simply killed them. At an even earlier period, eaten them, talking about cannibalism here. But at the stage of economic situation, which had now been attained, the prisoners acquired value, because their labor power had value, right? One therefore let them live and made use of their labor. Thus force, instead of controlling the economic situation, was on the contrary pressed into the service of the economic situation. Slavery had been invented, right? So famously for Engels, slavery is the second phase of sort of modes of production after the what he calls the primitive commune. It soon became the dominant form of production among all peoples who were developing beyond the old community, by which he means the egalitarian community of common tilling of the soil, but in the end was also one of the chief causes of their decay. It was slavery that first made possible the division of labor between agriculture and industry on a larger scale, and thereby also Hellenism, the flowering of the ancient world. Without slavery, no Greek state, no Greek art and science, and without slavery, no Roman Empire. But without the basis laid by Hellenism and the Roman Empire, also no modern Europe. We should never forget that our whole economic, political, and intellectual development presupposes a state of things in which slavery was as necessary as was universally recognized. In this sense, we are entitled to say, without the slavery of antiquity, no modern socialism. I don't recommend putting that on a t-shirt. This is one of the most interesting and horrifying and problematic statements within Anti-Duhring. But I want to know, more than simply sort of being shocked at the idea that, well, because there are these historical progressions and slavery was one of them, therefore slavery was, he says this, in the long run, a good thing. What do we actually make of this? What do we actually make of this? Is Engels going too far here in his wanting to depart from a sort of Duhringian moralism, in giving a sort of elegy for slavery, not in the 19th century, okay? Famously, right, Marx, on behalf of the First Working Man International in 1865, wrote an address to Abraham Lincoln, congratulating him on abolishing slavery and winning the Civil War. Okay, but still, is it too much to give an elegy for ancient, let's say, Greek city-state or Roman imperial slavery? What do we make of this? Matthew?
Yes, I don't think he's making a value judgment at all. I think he is making and allow me to use that word a second way, a value judgment. He said the prisoners acquired value and therefore they were the basis for such and such and such and such.
Yes.
He's tracking you through the material basis for society as you go from age to age. He is not making slavery was necessary for the modern age and therefore it is good. He never actually makes that whatever you want to call it, that I don't even know how to use the word, the Aristotle, their Aristotelian, whatever.
Doesn't matter.
Statement of the good is thus and such. He never actually says that. He just says the prisoners acquired value. Before that, they were eaten, and before that, they were simply killed. And now they have value. And now, because they had that, society, agriculture, and industry begin to diverge, and he goes from there. So I'll just leave it there. Thanks.
So thanks. No, so I agree, at least in the sort of presentation here, he's not making a value judgment like, wasn't slavery such a good thing? In fact, a paragraph later, he says, like, it's heretical to even say anything like what I'm about to say, but, right? He knows even then he's on the verge of being canceled in 2022. We can tell, right? But like he is making a value judgment though, right? Because as per our previous discussion from presentation A, he seems to actually think that socialism is a good thing, right? He's not just descriptive. He thinks socialism is a good thing. B, he thinks that slavery is necessary for Western Europe and therefore capitalism and therefore socialism. So C, by the magic of the transitive property, he appears to think that at least ancient forms of Greek, Hellenistic, Roman slavery were at least materially necessary for a good thing, and therefore maybe a good thing. Are we okay with that?
One could equally say that the bad characteristics of capitalism, which required slavery previously, were bad things. So slavery was necessary for bringing about the state under capitalism that causes pain and hardship. But it's also necessary if you're eventually going to develop socialism after that. So one could say that if one tried to make a moral judgment out of it, he supports both the negative and the positive at the same time within the same work. So,
but on balance, because socialism ultimately wins out, it appears to be an endorsement. In fact, later he says, and I think, I think you can actually do some good sort of Hegelian work defending this passage, but later he says, actually, even the slave themselves benefits from slavery, again, in ancient societies, because otherwise they would be eaten. If their labor power had no economic value, they would simply be killed outright or eaten. Roasted is the colorful term that he uses. He is really working hard to sort of defend this idea, even though he knows that, right, it's not anything one would want to defend in the 19th, let alone 20th or 21st centuries. He does appear to be making a certain sort of normative stance here. Jim, and then Connor.
Yeah, I think that it's a problem even for Engels, even in terms of the slavery that existed in the New World, because that was part of the primitive accumulation that Marx wrote about, which led to the development of capitalism.
Yeah.
So it's not just ancient slavery that's a problem for Engels; it's even modern slavery too.
It is modern slavery, although so Marx talks about New World slavery and capital. It doesn't appear to be the case that he thinks that it was absolutely necessary, but he does tie it to the English cotton trade and capitalism, that's for sure. Good, Connor.
Yes, I think this goes back to what we were talking about earlier in regards to this question of agency, right? Like in a way, the claim that Engels is trying to make is that, and it's close to a normative claim, but he basically says that civilization begins when one group of people robs another group of people over control over their life, quite seriously. And although it's very provocative to say that, you know, the worker is in some way in a similar position than the slave. I know, I mean, like, this is being recorded, right? But anyway, yeah, I mean, the worker does not have control over their life, like the previous person. So I say it's close to a normative claim because I think a normative claim is about like humanity in general, you know, but this is a claim about civilization that Engels is making. So it wasn't always like this, right? So it's not normative.
It wasn't always like what?
I mean, a slave is a historical object, right? There wasn't always slaves. So right, that's true. All right, so let me then, you're right. It appears to be sort of historical descriptive. Let me force the matter because I just noticed that Doug Green mentioned that Marx likes Spartacus. So good. Let me talk about what you've all been waiting for, the Third Servile War. Okay, so Third Servile War, 73 to 71 BCE. We have so the third of these three great slave uprisings on the Italian peninsula. You've seen Gladiator, right? And famously Spartacus, right, leading like his particular band of revolting slaves versus the general Crassus. And there's no hope, according to Engels, or reality, of the slaves founding a sustainable egalitarian society if they win. It's not going to happen because the level of technology isn't there. So if you were there at the time, now there's your moral judgment question. Like, what do you advise? If you're the Jiminy Cricket in Spartacus's helmet, what do you tell Spartacus? Do you tell him, you know, revolt and try and topple the slaveocracy? Do you tell him, don't revolt, but escape? Or do you tell him, no, put your shoulder into it because you're helping build civilization in 300 years or whatever, not more than that, right? What do you, you know, a couple millennia, what do you advise Spartacus if you're antiquity Jiminy Cricket, Doug?
Well, I mean,
you're doing like the Roman Senate.
Oh, I didn't even realize I did.
Right. Yeah.
But in all honesty, Spartacus or any like primitive communist rebel is not going to know the future. And, you know, you could say this about like the figures who came out of the French Revolution, Babeuf, who's more recent to Engels. We're not going to have communism in 1890s France or 1790s France any more than you would have communism in the Spartacus era. But it's like, you don't know the limits of history unless you're willing to push it. You know, that's just there. It's like, it's also, what does it mean if you surrender? If you're the oppressed, it means that's quite a horrible lesson to give to others who come after you, because then they'll be like, you know, they just gave up, you know. But I think in a certain sense, Marxism or socialism is the accumulation of all those failed popular struggles, you know, from the slaves of Spartacus to John Brown to Babeuf, all of them, to give it meaning in a time where it can be realized, where the historical conditions have you know, are available to create socialism.
So in the early 20th century, Luxemburg and Liebknecht, right, engage in this struggle in Germany, whose namesake is Spartacus.
Right, and they ended up in their own way crucified on the Appian Way by, you know, Gustav Crassus.
Yeah,
you know,
that's right.
Get an amalgam there, but. So it's like we should, in a sense, say, you know, take heart from those struggles, but it's like you don't even know if any struggle you engage in now is going to win either, necessarily. But you can, you know, study the historical conditions, your moment, and engage in it and try and push it to victory. It's the same that I would, you know, if you were 2,000 years ago and you were Spartacus.
Yeah,
I mean, I think Engels is arguing for determinism. I don't think he's arguing for fatalism. And I think that it's important to make that distinction.
He's not, because again and again, he says, well, we need to transform capitalism into socialism or society will perish. if he was a fatalist, he would say there will be socialism, iron laws of history, right? No, you're absolutely right. And that's the sort of political answer that I give people, that I give my class, which is, it wouldn't have worked out. That's true. We're good materialists. But you do the struggle because A, you don't really necessarily know how it's going to work out at the time, and B, it's going to inspire future generations. I tell people that, but isn't that like a bit of a dodge? Like, what if you could know? What if you can kind of tell that your productive capacities just aren't there? I mean, is it right to engage in this like suicidal struggle because maybe a couple of Germans a millennia and 3/4 later will like find it, a useful bit of propaganda? There's something perverse about that, especially when you consider like people are making decisions today as well, right? Is that a good basis to act? A, sort of local ignorance of how it'll work out, and B, it might inspire people a way long time later. Is that enough? Again, I don't want to be too brutal about it. It is what I tell people, but
I mean, I would say it is worth doing it. I mean, look at someone like Che Guevara, who you could argue is almost in a kind of similar situation, was going to lose and did lose, but recognized what that, death meant. And like, you've had other revolutionaries who've gone down and defeated and recognized, listen, it's better that if we know we're going to lose,
Right.
there's no way to win, that it's better to go down fighting and set an example with our sacrifice that others can learn from and hopefully do better next time. They will take the city, they'll take. Now, having said that, I don't think we should be like Custeristic and want
Right.
to go into like a losing battle. But if, the option, if you come to that point where there really is no way out, it's either death or surrender. And, what, you're going to be treated by an enemy who has proven they'll show you no mercy.
Yeah.
And maybe it is better to like go out in a blaze of glory, because if, all other options having been foreclosed, I think we should fight to win.
Yeah.
But if you're put in that corner, go down,
So and then I'm going to go to Matthew next. So would the nuanced Engelsian position therefore be, it was perhaps not good, but necessary that there was ancient slavery, but also good that there was Spartacus? The slaughter bench of history, the drama of history needed both. Would that be fair? Matthew, what do you think?
I'm not sure that it'd be fair, but you may as well have asked, should Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese have resisted, 40, 50 years ago, if you see that the odds are ridiculously stacked against you. I mean, we're talking about a nuclear power versus, a power of, people, running around on ancient roads and climbing trees, and they won, okay, against, overwhelming odds. I mean, like, I hate to drop a Star Trek reference, but there's a Deep Space Nine episode that plays with these themes. That like the first theme built is that the odds are absolutely against us. We will lose. Everyone will die. That is a mathematical certainty, and they drop it exactly that way. And then
That's a good episode, by the way.
the episode plays out where the leader of the station basically says, yeah, that's nice, but we're going to fight on because we have to be an example for the future, versus oh, well, our calculations show that if we just stand down in this much time, there'll be a resistance, and et cetera, even with that absolute certainty, what have people done historically is I think a good question to ask. Why did the Vietnamese stand up against a nuclear power, and how did they eventually win despite all odds? I mean, there's your Gordian knot cutter if you want it.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. All right. That's a good one to think on. Thanks. And Baruch Gottlieb.
Hi there.
Hi.
Sorry, I should have introduced myself. I know some of you from Facebook, etc. Nice to meet all of you. Yeah, I mean, there's so many interesting angles here. I think the question about good, ultimate good or universal good, needs to be qualified a little bit or like clarified, because are we talking about like what is good for human beings, or like every single human being, and is that good for human beings, like is something that we need to provide or we need to ensure for them whether they want it or not, according to our normative notion of what is good for human beings, because maybe they want to opt out of the good, but I mean, that's a central question of socialism, because when you're talking about like, okay, I mean, Marx is quite clear, capitalism is a very, very effective way of increasing the productive forces, right? And providing historically unprecedented better conditions for those who are lucky enough to be in the colonial economies. But what is socialism supposed to do that's better? And that is to ensure that everybody is raised up, right? And even ensure that, right? So raising the floor, right? And that requires something more than capitalism. It requires, and when you're talking about like, overcoming the what do you call the crises of capitalism, that's another side of what socialism is supposed to do. So if you think about Vietnam, and was it right, was it good for them to have rebelled? Well, I mean, is it good for them now? Well, how is the socialist project going in Vietnam? They are raising everybody up, right? Maybe there's still dissensus. There's still like there's still a capitalist class, there's a bourgeois class in Vietnam, and they are integrated just like they are in China. But we have had a socialist revolution there, which puts the party above the capitalist class, right? They are being disciplined by the party. And yeah, I mean, there is a moral assumption in that the party will decide what's good, and they will discipline everybody accordingly, whether they like it or not. And yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to bring this question about the normativity of the good of of ensuring the best possible opportunities for every human life. Yeah. Every human life. Is that what we're calling good? Because I mean, that's a question that I'm very concerned with, and thank you for the opportunity.
So I'm curious, but just to sort of pull on some of the threads here, if you don't mind. I'm just trying to parse what you said. So is the claim that one can not identify what the overall sort of optimal good for humanity would be? Or are you saying that this is possible and attainable? What exactly is the sort of claim here?
Well, I think that you do it dialectically, right? It would be a provisional good, which is posited, and of course it needs to be in as far as it's going to be economic policy or politically economically implemented. It has to be formulated in a way that it can be implemented consistently on through the whole sovereign territory, right? The nation, right? Okay. But that has to have a certain staying power. You have to have like a 5-year duration of your whatever provisional notion of good or of attaining good you would like to try. But I think what you see in like the Chinese, the Communist Party of China, is there's a lot of debate inside the party there all the way through the process of formulating that what eventually becomes policy for a certain period of time, and then that's adjusted after that period of time elapses.
Sure, and actually, there's a lot I'd like to say about this, but I don't want to. I want to keep a bit of my gunpowder dry because a lot of this is what Engels deals with in part 3 of Anti-Dühring. But indeed, so the question is, right, a number of the questions that comes up in part 3 of Anti-Dühring is, what is going to be the nature of the state, if there is a state, after the crises of capitalism cause its transformation to something new, namely socialism? And how does that actually operate? And what does it have to do, if anything, with democracy? Yeah, these are all interesting points that we definitely have to bring up. I want to move on to capitalism and surplus value in a minute, but let's give Matthew one more.
Just a quick question based on what you just said. When you mentioned that, you know, maybe someone would like to opt out of whatever's coming, the socialism, and my question is, that begs the big question: how much agency do you have in the first place to opt out at all? You know, under capitalism, under what you conceive as being, you know, what's coming under socialism in general, or some self-proclaimed socialist state, you know, because, you know, the historical socialist state, so-called socialist states, you didn't really have the power to democratically opt out yourself from whatever was going on, and you definitely don't have much agency to do so unless you have capital itself under this prevailing one, and under previous ones you had to be in a position of power to do that sort of opt out of society, but I mean, how much can you really call that opting out, and how much can you say it's like, you know, pulling a fast one? That was my question. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you know, again, I want to keep a lot of this for part 3, but there is something sort of romantic and well, in fact, Dühringian about this idea of opting out entirely. Right. Again, the entire thing, a fantastic segue, by the way, to presentation F, if you want to get a jump on it. A fantastic segue to presentation F on capitalism and surplus value and the critique of Eugen Dühring. But again, Dühring's whole point is that society supposedly starts with 2 wills, neither of which can assume anything positive of the other. Entirely egalitarian, self-sufficient, independent, following 17th and 18th century sort of social contract theory, right? Lockean contract theory, let's say, so whoever, right? And Engels just like relentlessly makes fun of him for this, right? Says that like there are no 2 independent sovereign wills. And the implication of what Engels is saying is that like if one was an entirely solitary will who could opt out, who could go off the grid, you would die, right? You can't maintain yourself, you can't subsist entirely separate from society. And so that might be part of the answer, but it's not, of course, the whole answer. So I want to take what was it, Burke Gottlieb was saying seriously. This is something that I work on, that I read on, which is, you know, something to discuss for part 3 in any case. What is the state of political toleration? There's not really a question of opting out and living by yourself. You can't live by yourself. It's not a thing that people can do. At least it's not a sustainable, reproducible thing. But indeed, it is a serious question as to what degree future society should be politically tolerant, and what does that political toleration look like? And more importantly, or at least equally importantly, theoretically, on what basis do we even approach or talk about political toleration? What kinds of things are tolerated, for whom and why, and on what basis, right? It certainly can't be, just to give a sketch of some of my future ideas about this, it certainly can't be based on the negative sort of liberal fallibilism, John Rawls style fallibilism of burdens of judgment, of we just don't know. Philosophy is hard. This is his idea of burdens of judgment, John Rawls. We just don't know. Philosophy is hard. We can't know for sure. Therefore, we have to be politically tolerant of people's beliefs. Well, I'm sorry. You know, some things formal logic is good for. And one thing that formal logic is good for is that you can't derive positive conclusions from merely negative premises. And that's what the liberal tries to do there with political toleration, that we don't know what's good for humans, so let's allow people to have a diversity of ideas, opinions, and beliefs. In fact, I think people should be given as wide berth as possible for ideas, opinions, beliefs, and indeed even communicating those. But it has to be based on something more substantial, something more positive than simply, I don't know. That's not good enough. That's not good enough, which is why I think we need to think more seriously about philosophy, but next time. All right, here's what I'd like to do. If you want to look at presentation F, slides 2 and 3. Now it's already 5:23. There's a couple of questions I want to ask you because, or else I won't be able to sleep through the night tonight. So I'll just tell you them out loud instead of torturing you and reading them to you. Engels continues his critique of Dühring specifically with respect to surplus value, exchange value under capitalism. He characterizes Dühring's position as this. Dühring seems to say that the value of a commodity, the value of something which is produced, is equal to the cost of maintaining the worker that produces that thing. In other words, under capitalism, wages. So the value of a commodity equals the value of the wages that are paid out to the worker. To which Engels says, that doesn't make any sense. Right? That's a mathematical absurdity, because if you need to pay a worker the equivalent of 7 hours wages to survive, and for 7 hours of work, then how much profit is the capitalist going to be able to make? Zero. And that's not the case. Actually, capitalists make profits. That's what makes a capitalist a capitalist. There's a problem there. Now, the Dühringian response, of course, is some more moralizing, some more talk about political force and original sins and things like that. Well, so the problem is, Dühring will come back and say, well, yeah, see, the worker should get 7 hours of value in terms of wages for his 7 hours of effort, but the capitalist steals some. In which case Engels comes back, this is the sort of forensics of this debate, and says, no, because if he stole some, then the worker wouldn't be able to survive, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? Wages can't be equal to simply the output of the worker. This does not work in any case mathematically. To make it even simpler, right? He says on the following page, and here, this, if you want to fact check me, it's on slide 3, presentation F, right? Let's say that it takes on average 7 hours of work to maintain, produce, and reproduce a worker. So this is all of the on average aggregate work of every other worker in society, providing food, clothing, entertainment, medical care, whatever. Let's say on average it takes 7 hours of labor to maintain a worker for 1 day. But and therefore you pay the worker the equivalent of that in order to redeem those things, food, clothing, entertainment, and society. But that doesn't mean, of course, that the worker only works for 7 hours. Famously, and you can read this in the Grundrisse in Capital, in Marx's Wage, Labor, and Capital, and here in part 2 of Anti-Dühring, what the capitalist buys is not the direct labor of the worker, but that which has value, which is the labor power, the capacity to expend labor. And so although he only pays the equivalent of 7 hours of work, the worker works for 12 hours, the difference there, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 5 hours, that is the basis of surplus labor, and under capitalism, surplus exchange value. And that's what under capitalism translates into profits, okay? Because the direct labor exceeds what is paid out in wages. The telling phrase from slide 3 that Engels uses is this. He says that after all, it is clear that what a laborer produces and what he costs are just as much different things as what a machine produces and what it costs. Okay, and so in other words, what determines how much it costs to purchase the labor power of a worker for 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 1 year? Well, it comes down to, just like with the machine, the cost of production, how much it costs to produce that worker. And it is entirely separate from the direct labor, the actual output of that worker. Indeed, the capitalist has every incentive in the world to increase the amount of direct labor, how intense and how long the working day is, while keeping the cost of producing the worker, having the worker fed and clothed, exactly very much the same. That's why there are all sorts of very, like, I live in a pretty affluent area. I can't always keep up, okay? But there are all sorts of supposedly liberal, progressive, humane-minded initiatives to produce affordable worker housing, which is good because people can't afford to live here. People who work in the university, teachers, nurses, right? They can't afford to live here. But really, it's also good for the people employing them, right? And maybe even better for the people employing them because it is going to ultimately cost less to maintain the worker, right? The wages will fall to meet what it costs to maintain that worker, including food, rent, entertainment. So one of the interesting questions that I'm still working through here is this. It appears to be the case for both Marx and Engels that surplus value, surplus exchange value, something that can be quantified, only exists under capitalism. Okay? Because only in capitalism are there commodities which are produced in order to sell for money and generalized commodity exchange. But surplus labor is apparently transhistorical. It's not that it's always existed, but it has existed before capitalism, right? Engels, in fact, in Anti-Dühring says that unless there was surplus labor, some kind of reserve fund of labor, there could have been no progress from the original egalitarian commune through ancient despotism and slavery, through feudalism, capitalism, late capitalism, and ultimately socialism, right? So surplus labor is something which pre-exists surplus value. And I'm curious as to like how, so apparently you can have one without the other, but I've always been curious as to how, right? How is it that you can have surplus labor, but that it is not quantifiable in the same way that surplus value or surplus exchange value is quantified? We take the example of feudalism, okay? We have the feudal lord. The feudal lord is enriched for having serfs work on the serfs on the lord's land. The serf might work for themselves 5 days a week, and then for 2 days out of that week, they pay tribute to the lord of the manor or the lord of the manor and the church. And the lord appears to enrich himself. So the question is the feudal lord wealthy as compared to the serf? There's a simple question for you. So before we get into all like the sort of complicated debates, take out your hands. Who thinks that under feudalism, the feudal lord is wealthy as compared to the serf that works on the lord's land? All right, raise your hand if you think that's the case. All right, good, everybody. All right. Why? How, or in other words, how can the feudal lord be wealthy if there are no exchange values under feudalism? It's not capitalism yet.
I mean, the mechanism's different.
Okay, how do you mean?
I mean, instead of the surplus value deriving from unpaid labor in the production process, the surplus labor comes from a more, how did they put it? Not going to name drop again, but
That's fine.
The product was more transparently taken separately. You know, you maintained your field and then you went and maintained someone else's, and the ways in which the system was administered 2
Yes.
days became 5, and 5 days became 10. And next thing you know, you're spending 2/3 of your year working for the Lord when it was only advertised as maybe a quarter or something like that.
Right. Right. So eventually, you have people that are working for you for greater and greater portions of their time. It appears to be that if you're the recipient of that tribute, you're doing well, right? But that does not translate into any exchange value, according to Marx and Engels, correct?
Well, it depends.
I don't know if this is a feature or a bug, right? So if you want to look at it as a feature, right, of Marxism, we have this idea that prior to capitalism, there is this idea of labor and surplus labor, and that is the thing that once there's generalized commodity exchange translates into surplus value, surplus exchange values. That's sort of the feature story. The bug is that looking backwards, if I'm going to be, so I'm a fan of Engels and Marx, but if I'm going to be critical, self-critical about what I'm a fan of, the bug is that when you look backwards into it, it's very difficult to explain apparent wealth disparities in societies as complicated as, let's say, medieval feudalism. When also you claim that there isn't wealth.
Yeah, but
how are there wealth disparities if there isn't wealth in a sort of properly quantifiable way?
can you really read the categories backwards, though? Some of those categories exist purely for the current one and didn't necessarily apply at all.
Sure, we need not. Then if we just take feudalism on its own terms, were there wealthier people and less wealthy people? It seems obvious enough. If you have tapestries and you can hire retainers and you can have people that clean out your chamber pots or whatever people used, you seem to be wealthy. And if you're always at the edge of starvation, you're not wealthy at all. But there was no exchange value. How was that wealth calculated? I assume we want to say it's not merely subjective, right? If it was merely subjective, you could be religious and spiritual about it and say, well, it's wealth is in the eye of the beholder. I don't think any historical materialist wants to say that. All right, so then if there were wealth disparities, and what did those wealth disparities consist precisely? Connor, help us out here.
Yeah, I think it just comes down to land. Like,
Okay.
Who owns more land? Like, I don't think a serf, like, they're able to work the land and live on the land, but they don't own the land, right? Like the Lord owns the land. And I think wealth here can kind of be measured in, who gets to allocate, who gets to do what with my land, something like this. So.
But if you own the land and had, I think there's something to that for sure. If you own the land and you had no one to work your land, you're very bad off, aren't you? Right. This is why the serfs were tied to the land, indeed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's the land, but it's also like the direct labor acting on the land, is it not?
I would agree.
Okay.
Okay, wait, but the labor cannot take place unless the land is protected. So you need to be able to pay soldiers to protect the land, or you need to provide some kind of security for that land. Otherwise, it will be taken over by other people.
Very good. All right,
So-
down the rabbit hole with Baruch Gottlieb. Absolutely. So in order to have the land and have direct labor working on the land, one needs to be able to claim the land as yours, which requires not only sort of royal decree, but also the muscle, being able to hire the foot soldier with the pike in order to stab people who try and leave or take your land. Indeed. Now, down the rabbit hole, how do you pay that feudal thug? How do you pay them?
You can pay
Where does
them.
the value come from where you pay that person?
You can pay them with land. That was often that was a common way. So they could. That was like a colonial process in the early days of Roman colonialism.
Absolutely. But if you only pay them with land, eventually you won't have any left. Yes.
It depends how much you pay them.
This is how subtraction works, right? Like eventually.
But I mean, you don't need to only pay them with land. You can pay them with other kinds of accumulated goods, which everybody needs.
Yes.
Like salt or
Exactly. So originally in
That is
Roman
it.
times, right, this is where the word salary comes from. It comes from the word sal, salt, right? Now, of course, salt has value. Now, we, as good Orthodox Marxists and Engelsians, we don't want to say it has exchange value. Then that's a sin. We're not talking about capitalism yet, but salt has some kind of currency, some kind of proto value, right? Some kind of worth, even in feudalism, pre-capitalism, because it takes some direct labor in which to mine it and refine it and store it. No, like you couldn't pay the foot soldier in air because it's just readily available everywhere. There's a reason why the salt is worth something, and not just because of its use, because air is also useful, but the salt is scarce and you have to mine it and you know, procure it basically, right?
Used to preserve food, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's very useful. But a lot of things are useful, which don't necessarily count as something that you can use to pay people with, right? It has to involve some kind of labor in which to extract it.
well, I mean, use value is another category of value, which is essential for Marxist political economy. So I think it should be useful, especially in the pre-capitalist period. But, you know, of course, everybody agrees that pre-capitalist period is not homogeneously pre-capitalist.
Sure.
There are like proto-capitalist practices going back to Roman times.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, that's important to point out. But if we're testing the sort of Marxist statement that there was no exchange value and there was therefore no value proper prior to capitalism, it's a bit of a dodge. It's a bit of an easy thing to say that, well, it wasn't uniform. Yeah, indeed, you're right. It wasn't uniform, but there appears to be systemic, noticeable disparities in wealth at a time where supposedly there wasn't wealth. All right, related to this, in the same presentation F, all right, slide 8 specifically, I won't read it to you, but I'll just say it out loud. Engels makes the claim, the sort of orthodox claim, that for money to become capital, it has to encounter, and therefore to have the ability to purchase exchange values, it has to encounter free labor in the marketplace. And famously, he says free labor is expressed in a double sense. First, free labor means that the worker is not, as with feudalism, bound to the land, right? That they're able to dispose of their labor power as they please through freely devised contracts, 1 hour, 1 week, 1 year at a time, however you might, and also free in the sort of negative sense that they have no other assets to their name except that their ability to work. And he makes a further historicist claim that this only first started to take place, again, as Baruch Gottlieb would say, unevenly and bits at a time in, let's say, the 15th and 16th centuries, with certain mercantile discoveries and international merchant trade. Good. So capitalism can only become capitalism. There can only be capital accumulation when there's a free working class. So in other words, under the current epoch and not in earlier ones, as in feudalism. And furthermore, as against Eugen Dühring, he says that, and this is a direct quote, if you want to look it up, it's on slide 7, that the capitalist class as a whole in any country cannot overreach themselves, right? So in other words, that the capitalist can't, can only extract surplus value at the point of production by paying the worker less for their labor power than they expend in direct labor during the working day. Classic Orthodox Marxism, fine, very well. In other words, and in another slide, I have this, I believe, also in presentation F, you cannot have capitalism and you cannot have sustained profit making through things like mere speculation or mere fraud or more ridiculous things, just like theft and robbery, right? Because that merely divides up the pie in different ways, but it doesn't increase, it doesn't produce surpluses like exploitation at the point of production does. You can't have exploitation at the point of production, right? You can't have exploitation at the point of production unless you have free labor. This is an interesting, potentially problematic, but also foundational point of Marxism, right? unless there is free labor and therefore a division between the labor power on the one hand, which is freely sold by the free worker, and on the other hand, the direct labor which they expend during the working day, unless there's a division between those two things, there's no possibility of profit making. Profit making precisely is the thing which takes advantage of the conceptual, but also the real material gap between what it costs to produce the worker and how much the worker freely sells their labor, how many hours a day they're willing to work. In other words, in the case of slavery, and Marx deals with this in Capital itself, in the case of slavery, there are no profits to be made. Now, let me be absolutely clear here. I'm not talking about North American slavery tied to the English cotton trade, okay? I'm not talking about slavery, in other words, in the 19th century in America as a sort of adjunct to world capitalist trade or continental capitalist trade. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about pre-capitalist, even pre-feudal, ancient slavery, when slavery was the hegemonic form of production and exchange. According to Marx and Engels, with slavery, there is no profits to be had. Why? Because with the slave, the ancient slave, there is no distinction between the cost of producing the slave and their labor power on the one hand, and their freely sold direct labor on the other. There is no freely sold direct labor, and so Marx treats the ancient slave as something like constant capital, like, let's say, a machine used in production, right? And you can't make profits off of a machine used in production, right? If you buy a lemonade making machine, and the lemonade making machine costs $100, and it has the ability to make 100 lemonades, and then it goes kaput forever, guess how much each of those lemonades is worth, all things being equal in a robust enough marketplace? $1, right? Simple mathematical depreciation, right? There's no profit being made. You're simply investing and then depreciating as you produce things. Good. I think that's basically true, but all right, let me give you a problematic thought experiment. Could there be a society which is a, let's say, advanced contemporary slaveocracy, a slave society, in which there are a class of slave owners on each separate estate? They exploit their slaves terribly in order to produce goods which are sold on a market to other owners of other estates. And if that society existed, why would there not be profits? Seems like there would be surplus labor, and there would be exchange of the products of surplus labor. And indeed, there might be something kind of like commodities, because each estate would produce things for the purpose of exchange, right? Would there be profits? So again, here's the basic Marxist moral mathematical question. In a contemporary slaveocracy with multiple slave estates, could there be profits? This is a basic question. Could there be profits? Okay, if you think there could be profits, and you have to pick one. I'm going to call you out by name if you don't. If you think there could be profits, okay, raise your hand. All right, very good. 1, 2. I'm surprised at Doug Green. Did he lower his hand already? Okay.
No, I've raised my hand.
Interesting. All right, who says there could not be profits? In a contemporary slaveocracy, each estate exploits its own and sells on a common market for money. No profits. All right, raise your hand. Profits wouldn't be possible. All right, I'm going to be the mean professor. Connor! Stop passing notes.
I
Connor.
I had a feeling you're going to pick on me.
Yeah, because you were looking off, like, away from the camera, and so I was just doing this.
I'm paying attention, Professor. Please.
I know.
But yeah.
What, all right, I don't care. I don't know what the answer is. This is something that's been driving me nutty recently, because this thought experiment seems to just be like the Mobius strip of surplus value. What's your first impression? Feel free to be wrong, because God knows I am.
Yeah, I'm not settled either, but my hunch is that I don't think it would be profits, in the sense that I think what is happening in this market is they're trying to maintain the market as such, so that things can keep happening, maintain the system. But I don't know, my mind is going towards, I was reading Marx's philosophical manuscripts the other day, and one of the points he makes is that with the emergence of capitalism, what begins to happen is that capital is not in service of maintaining workers or this, that, or the other, right? Yeah. Capital is in service of maintaining the system. And in order to maintain the system, you need profits. Well, this is just the logic of capitalism.
Wait, sorry, say that sentence again, but slower.
Sure. So yeah, in capitalism, there seems to be this detachment from the material conditions of production.
Yeah.
And so in that way, everything becomes quantifiable, and capitalism is in service of the numbers, right? So, this is kind of like the big leaping point from feudalism, where you're trying to maintain serfs, the land, this, that, and the other, which is to say that it's materially grounded. And in that way, I don't think we're yet at profits, as we think of it. I hope this is making sense, but
yeah.
Yeah.
So a result could be profits, but the end isn't profits. I think Daniel just wrote something in the chat. Profits may happen, but they are not necessary. Good. For the perpetuation of that particular system, perhaps is one way to say it. Very good. Yeah. So this is one of the things I wanted to say, but I wanted to hold it back. Good. So that you might get more coin if your plantation sells vases. People need a lot of vases. You might get more coin on the market. But that coin isn't necessary for maintaining your estate. Your estate is a sort of self-sufficient commune, except one based on exploitation. All right, good. Doug, I think, was next.
Yeah,
Yes.
I wanted to explain my answer about the slave society with profit. And I think in isolation, if this was just the slave society, then no, you're not going to have profit. But we can actually look to a concrete example where there was profit in a slave society, which is the American South.
Yeah.
Because that society was not just in isolation, it was connected to the northern states of the United States, but also to the world market, British textile industry and whatnot. And in a sense, there was profit coming from that for the slave owners. And some of them were very much tied to northern business interests or British interests. But at the same time, capitalism in the South was hampered in its development by the slave society.
Yes.
You did not have a free labor force, at least not for the majority of the, just by definition, those were not free proletarians, they were slaves. So in that sense, you do have a slave society in the American South that was producing profit, but as Daniel said, it really wasn't also within that system. It was actually producing a clash with the slave system, the encroachments of capitalism, which is, kind of the traditional orthodox Marxist take on the US Civil War, is a clash between two different social systems, the industrial capitalist North and the slave South. So in that sense, I do think that it was possible to have profit in that society, but it was also a sign that you were going to have some kind of clash between two different modes of production. And I'm not as familiar on, say, Brazilian slavery, which also existed around the same time, but I'd imagine that there was also these encroachments of capitalism, and that Brazilian slavery was also very much tied into the world market, and with a class of mercantilists who were intermarried or had different relations with slave owners. So
no, absolutely.
Here's my answer that I think preserves orthodoxy, but still says yes.
Good job. So in the 19th century, absolutely, you do have profits going towards southern plantation owners, but it's sort of parasitic on the nature of profit seeking under capitalism, which is why in, let's say, the North and parts of the West, you have the Free Soil Party. Free Soil Party supported largely by so-called free laborers, because they don't want their value degraded by being put in direct competition with slaves, but also like small manufacturers too, right? Because they're in direct competition with this system. And so this is a very orthodox answer, very good. But again, I'm not sure why there isn't at least incidental profits in this pure slavery situation. Matthew?
I think it's one of those yes, but no answers.
Okay.
I think profit as such is one of those categories that if you decouple it from the word,
Yeah.
exists trans-economically, but it exists under different labels depending on the mode of production and class society. Under slavery, it's called something else. Under feudalism, it's going to be called something else, and under communism in the future, should it come about, it will be called yet again something else. But again, it will play the role of maintaining that system. But could you take the label and ironclad apply it to a situation under slavery or under feudalism? That's a categorical no.
Okay.
Because that very particular articulation would have been looked at as something else. If you read at least one of the philosophers, I think it's Aristotle, but a couple of others, they talk about profit making as being an evil and parasitic upon the economic system that prevails. And so in that sense, it is a categorical no, and it was even seen as a moral wrong for that particular articulation to be the maintaining factor. The maintaining factor is X, and it shifted from one articulation to another depending on the mode. So that's my answer. There are profits to be made under the slavery system, but it's called something else and it's articulated differently.
But it's called, okay. So it's called something else. Is that, but is that more than a semantic difference then?
No, because it's not a semantic difference to say that from mode of production to mode of production, you have a category that's labeled, this is what's used to grow and maintain the system.
Yeah.
Under this one, it's called profits. Under others, it's called something else, and and the mechanics of it can be vastly different and have been. But you can get no closer than that abstract. Yeah, if you get as specific, if you get into that very specific particular, can profits be made under slavery? No, they cannot. And you were usually punished for making profits under slavery or under feudalism. But could you do the thing that would maintain the system? Then yes, you could. But so there it is.
Okay. Okay. Jim.
I think this is one of these areas where Marxist analysis would differ from the kind of analysis that neoclassical economists would give.
Yep.
Neoclassical economists would tend to understate the differences between different modes of production, and they would argue that there are universal economic laws that apply to all these different systems.
Exactly.
So there is a literature from neoclassical economists on American slavery, which views it as basically as a profit-driven system. Not much different from other kinds of, not all that different, say, from industrial capitalism.
Okay. So in this thought experiment, and I'll move off it now to the last thing. In this thought experiment, the reason it was designed like this is because it confutes the classic distinction people make between capitalism and pre-capitalism, which is commodity production, right? Producing things in order to get money, right? MCM, money, commodity, money, right? Rather than CMC. In this case, in this thought experiment, right, the owner of each slave estate invests a certain amount of money to produce a commodity, not for local consumption primarily, but for selling on a market in order to gain more money at the back end. So indeed, I'm very sensitive to all these ideas that, right, as as Marxists, as opposed to classical, neoclassical economists, right, with this idea that there are different rules that operate for each kind of mode of production. But as a philosopher, I'm interested in like, what's the difference that makes the difference between these? And at least in this thought experiment, in this case, it can't be commodity production. That still seems to be possible, even with the use of slave labor. So maybe one idea that Daniel put forward is like, well, it's the centrality or essentiality of profit making as opposed to profit making being a side effect. That could be one. Another one that comes to mind is the idea of the necessity under capitalism of reinvesting for more and more efficient production. So in my thought experiment, you could go on indefinitely producing vases here and toasters there, and extracting, grinding out your surplus labor, which you could call value or not, depending on how hygienic you are with your semantics. But extracting surplus labor in any case, year after year after year, without necessarily the need for reinvestment, because there's might be commodity production, but there's not robust competition, right? This is another idea as well. In general, though, which brings me to the last thing, Engels seems to suggest, I think rather soundly, that it is only with this reserve fund of surplus labor that society can make any advances whatsoever. And the thing which is going to distinguish socialism not only from capitalism, but from all other systems which preceded it, is the idea that this reserve fund of surplus labor will for the first time be captured not by this class or that class, but by the universal class, the class of the proletariat, in the name of humanity as such. Just very quickly, because it is inspiring. Let me share with you the final slide of G, right here. Very good. Here's what he says. Oh, sorry. I have to change it first. I apologize. Here's what he says. Only the immense increase, and this is only possible because of advanced technology, only the immense increase of productive forces attained by modern industry has made it possible to distribute labor among all members of society without exception, and thereby to limit the labor time of each individual member to such an extent that all have enough free time to take part in the general, both, and this is the important part, both theoretical and practical affairs of society. It is only now, therefore, that every ruling and exploiting class has become superfluous and indeed a hindrance to social development. There's only now, too, that it will be inexorably abolished, however much it may be in possession of direct force. A final ding at Dühring there. But what this points to is the idea that, yes, it is surplus labor, this reserve fund, which allows society to be society at all. And under socialism, and uniquely under socialism, is the surplus reserve fund of labor that will be taken up on behalf of everyone. And this has practical effects for what a future socialist society will look like. Namely, to quote Lenin and more directly CLR James, that every cook can govern, that everyone is freed from the rigors and the monotony of daily labor to such a degree that everyone has the bandwidth, the space to develop their theoretical and executive capacities such that they can actually engage in common governance of society. And one of the things, if we have the opportunity to discuss part 3, will indeed be on this very question, which is that what a future social society would in fact look like? Would it be a society in which everyone engages in sort of direct, nearly constant participation in common governance? And indeed, how would that be possible? All right, well, anyway, I've gone already 2 minutes over, so I'll stop myself right now. But thank you very much for sticking with it. I appreciate it. I learned a lot.
All right. Great job, Landon. Thank you. I want to just invite everyone to thank Professor Frim for a wonderful facilitated conversation that was very spirited. And enlightening. Personally, found quite a lot out of it. It was felt really good to get at things at this kind of essential root level. So we meet again in 2 weeks from today, and I will indicate on Zoom. You'll get an auto reminder, and there's a great reading on YouTube from a socialist channel that I'll send to everybody. In fact, let me just put it right now. If you have 1 minute, I can put it in the chat for you. It's a audio reading, so when you're working or whatever, you can listen to Anti-Duhring section 3. Read. Let's give me 1 second. I think this is worth it. On YouTube, you could also search it. Yeah. Yep. Okay. Here it is. So, actually, you know what? That's not the right one. I'll send it over email, and I'll post it on our Twitter page, just in case you want to start it now, so you have enough time to look at it. But thanks again, Landon, and really great stuff. We'll be in touch.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
See you.